Jesus Christ is by far the most influential individual in world history. No one has caused as many ripples in history as he has done. Even in modern secular Europe, we are walking around in the ripple effects of his life and his teaching and of what he started. Too few people are really aware of that. If you think about modern life, the mark of Jesus is still there all the time. We can think about how we structure the year. In a few months' time, our whole culture will just get crazy for a full month. Millions of euros will be involved. Every city will be marked by it. Something called Christmas. It's this man's birth. A few months later, at least in Sweden, a lot of people will go north to go skiing because everyone is free from job. It's something called Easter. It's this man's death. Every Sunday in the calendar is red, and the shops have different opening times, and the trains are, the timetable is different. And that is because of his resurrection. All the great institutions that we value so highly in our culture are inspired by him, like the universities. They grew out of the monasteries, which had become study centers. They had great libraries and they had debates. And the university started with the goal of trying to understand this universe as a creation of God. We think of the hospitals and that we take care of the weak and the suffering, the sick. It all goes back to the inspiration from this man, from Jesus, who touched the lepers, who healed the sick, who had an eye for the vulnerable and the suffering individual. We can think of the names we are having. In my country, people have names like Maria or Johannes or Peter or Stefan. Well, that's not typical Viking names. That's are the names of this man's, of Jesus' friends and family. So you cannot be a intellectually aware person in the 21st century without having knowledge about Jesus. But as soon as we ask this question, I need knowledge about this person who have affected my culture, actually still affecting my life, even if I'm not a Christian. How can I come in contact with Jesus? That raises the historical question. How on earth can I bridge the gap between 2020, where I live, and the 30s, where he is supposed to have lived and taught and so on? Is there a possibility to travel over such an distance? This is the historical questions. And as soon as you raise that, and I've raised it many times especially with students, you can see a number of fallacies coming into people's thinking. When people are discussing how can we bridge this gap between our present and antiquity, a lot of people immediately start to speculate. Couldn't it be like this or like that? They formulate a theory, but it's pure speculation. It's not based on any sources, on any witnesses from that time or any testimonies. It's just a logical possibility. Like maybe Jesus had a wife, and then maybe he had kids, and then maybe there are a bloodline still on planet Earth going back to Jesus of Nazareth. But that is not discussing history. That is just creating novels. You're writing your own novel about Jesus. Some people, when it comes to Jesus, are constantly raising the bar higher and higher, and whatever evidences there are, their response is always not enough evidence. And of course, in history, you can always put the bar so high, so nothing is enough. But that is not how historians deal with this kinds of issue. We have to discuss not our own imagination, but we have to discuss the sources that are really there, that we do actually have. And we need to use ordinary historical method to evaluate the evidence. So, the interesting thing is that we have fascinating sources about Jesus of Nazareth. And the four most important, I have here in my hand, it's the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who gives us a description of Jesus' public life, of his teaching, his ministry, and especially of his last week in Jerusalem. What happened before his death, and the actual execution and the burial, and what is told about what happened after the burial, his resurrection. So the Gospels are the most important sources about Jesus of Nazareth. Coming so far, I know that a lot of secular people immediately raises objections when they hear about the Gospels being the main sources about Jesus. So let me respond to a number of very common objections. So people say, the Gospels, but that's the Bible. I'm not interested in the Bible. I want to read historical sources about Jesus. Yeah, that's a good objection. Or actually, maybe not. If you think about it, the Gospels were not written as Bible. They are four separate historical sources about Jesus that was later gathered into a collection of books that we call the Bible, and they were collected because they were the earliest and the best texts about Jesus. But they have not changed in their historical status because people later on collected them into something we today call the Bible. Now, this is very common in if you study history. If you want to study antiquity, you have to read the text of Josephus. And the easiest way is to buy the complete works of Josephus. After his death, some people have collected his writings into one collection of books, but they still have the same historical value. Or you have to read Tacitus and Plutarch and Suetonius and the other Roman historians. And one easy way is to buy a collection of the primary sources of Rome. People have collected the earliest and best text of the Roman historians. A second objection is that people say the Gospels, but they are religious. I'm not interested in religion. I'm interested in historical source material. It's true that the Gospels contains a lot of religious references to God and the supernatural, to signs and wonders, and to angels. That's true. But does that in itself makes it into a non-historical text? Again, we need to look at text from antiquity and compare the Gospels to other sources from the same period. A historian, Ben Witherington, says this: one thing that definitively distinguishes modern historiography from almost all forms of ancient historiography is that the ancients did not hesitate to include the divine or the supernatural in the narratives of historical events. This is so with most historical material up until the Enlightenment, because people believed in the supernatural. And of course, when they were telling what has happened, they were not afraid of referring to the supernatural. Let me give you an example from antiquity. A very famous event took place the 10th of January 49 BC, when Julius Caesar stood in the north of Italy at a river called Rubicon, and he hesitates if he should, with his soldiers, cross the Rubicon and march towards Rome. And several of the ancient historians are writing about that and about the hesitation from Julius Caesar. And Suetonius, who by the way mentioned Jesus in one passage, he tells us this: as Caesar stood in doubt, this sign was given him. On a sudden there appeared hard by a being of wondrous stature and beauty, who sat and played upon a reed. Then Caesar cried, "Take with the course which the signs of the gods and the false dealing of our foes point out. The die is cast." So according to Suetonius, Caesar made his decision to cross the Rubicon because of a supernatural event. A vision was given to him from the gods. Now, what does the historians do when they read this? Do they say, oh, now we don't know anything about Julius Caesar and Rubicon? No, they don't. Of course, we are not obliged to believe in the gods Suetonius are referring to here. That's a philosophical question. Do we believe in any gods? Most of us do not believe in those gods. There are good reasons to reject the old Roman gods. But it's still a philosophical question. Do we believe in the supernatural or not? Is there a God who can interact in history, or is there not? Regardless of your position on that issue, you can study the Gospels and learn about Jesus and his teaching and what people thought about him, how they interpreted the events they saw, and so on. So you cannot dismiss the Gospels because there are supernatural references. A third objection, and maybe that is the most common, is to say, but the Gospels, they are subjective. They are written by the friends of Jesus, his disciples. They are manipulative. They are propaganda. I would like to have objective historical material. So would I, actually. That would be really nice to have strict objective historical material. The problem is that that is not to be found anywhere on any period of history. All historical writings come from one perspective instead of another. So all historical material is in one sense subjective. But that is not always bad, actually. Here we need to do some thinking. This is the old philosopher Socrates. How do we know about Socrates? He didn't write anything by himself. We have no writings from him. We know about these famous philosophers through 4 different sources. And they are Aristophanes, who was a contemporary writer, comedy writer, who mentions Socrates. It's Plato, who during a period of 50 years after Socrates' death, wrote about his master because Plato was a disciple of Socrates. And then it's Xenophon, who 40 years after Socrates' death wrote about Socrates. He was a friend of Socrates, and he also became a disciple. And then it's Aristotle, who was a disciple of Plato. So it's a little bit later, it's one step away from Socrates. 50 to 60 years after Socrates, he writes about him. Now, historians are telling us that 2 of these 4 sources are most valued, and that is Plato. Because he was the disciple of Socrates. That means he knew him. And it's Xenophon, because he was his friend. So, being close to a person or being close to events makes you, in one sense, subjective, but that can also be a real strength. Imagine yourself that you're going to write a biography of someone. The person is dead, so you cannot interview the person, him or herself. Then what do you want to do? You want to interview everyone close to that person, friends and families and co-workers and so on. Are they subjective? Yes, but they are still the best witnesses. And the really exciting thing is that we have material from people that were close to Jesus, which means it comes from people who really knew. A fourth objection, which is a more theological objection, it comes from people who have been in contact with academia. That objection is to say, but the Gospels, they are not historical material. They are a unique genre. They are kind of faith documents. And that is true. That has been a very common academic view during the part of the 19th century and a good part of the 20th century. It's called form criticism, where scholars have made a distinction between the Jesus of history, the real Jesus there back in the 30s, and then the Christ of faith, which is the message the church proclaimed in the 70s or 80s or 90s about Jesus. And that's not really the same. And the only thing we come in contact with is the Christ of faith, not the historical person of Jesus. Form criticism, let's see, I will just give you the right PowerPoint. Form criticism was launched by a German scholar called Schmidt. And he wrote he wrote like this: a gospel is by nature not high literature, but low literature, not a product of an individual author, but a folk book, not biography, but a cult legend. So he was against what people rather naturally have assumed about the Gospels, that they were a kind of biography. No, he wanted to see the Gospels as a separate kind of literature, which is not biography. And a number of, especially German academics, they adopted that perspective on the Gospels. So the famous Rudolf Bultmann, he could say the Gospels are a unique phenomenon in the history of literature. It's a unique phenomenon in the history of literature. So they looked at the Gospel as a special kind of literature that does not put you in contact with history, but just with the early church. Now, interestingly enough, this perspective has been challenged and the whole academic situation have changed, and that is to a large degree through a scholar called Richard Burridge and his book, What Are the Gospels? He has very convincingly shown that Schmidt and Bultmann and others are wrong, and that the Gospels belong to a broad, well-known literary genre, namely the Greco-Roman biography genre. And he says the identification of the Gospel genre as a type of Greco-Roman biography has now become the consensus among New Testament scholars. So actually today, people in the academic world view the Gospels as biography. Even a very critical scholar as Bart Ehrman says the Gospel are best seen as a kind of Greco-Roman, as opposed to modern, biography. Now, I find this very fascinating. Our time, we are obsessed with biographies. You go into a bookstore and on the top list, there's always a number of biographies of famous people like Michelle Obama, or rock stars, or influential people. It's so interesting to come close to those persons, those people that have a real influence. Now, it looks like we have 4 biographies of the world's most influential person, Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, we should study those biographies. A last objection. People say, but aren't the gospel anonymous writings? That has been popular to say because you don't find the author in the text itself. It comes as a label above the text, but it's not included in the text. Like if you read letters from Paul, it says this is from Paul, a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ, to. So you have the author and the recipient of the letter. You know that within the text itself. It looks like that you don't have the author named in the introduction of the Gospels. So people have claimed that the Gospels are anonymous. But here we need to do some thinking again. Are the Gospels really anonymous writings? We need to distinguish between formal anonymity, that you don't have the author in the text, but that is not the same as an actual anonymity. A lot of books in the contemporary world does not have the author in the text itself. You find the author on the cover, but none in the text. So even if the text have a kind of formal anonymity, it's not an actual anonymity. Everyone knows exactly who wrote the text between the covers. There's a lot of books from antiquity that is written this way, but we know who the author was because we can see it in lists of books, list over books, who the author was to a specific book. The actual authorship was known even if there was a formal anonymity, because that information was passed on when reading the text aloud, when copying the text, and when the text was collected in libraries. It would be total chaotic if no one knew about the authors of all the texts. Martin Hengel, another German scholar and theologian, he has written very convincingly that the Gospel were not anonymous writings. And there are a number of reasons for that. Here are 3 of them. The author were named when read in church service. The author were named when a church received a new gospel. Of course, they wanted to know who has written this text. And the gospel titles are unanimous in all sources. And such unity cannot be forced upon a local congregation at a later stage. So we can see historically that everywhere, by everyone, the authors are named the same, even though people are spread out around the whole of the Mediterranean, Turkey, Italy, France, Egypt, Tunisia. People far away from each other are naming the authors the same way. It was known who has written the Gospels. So, my point by responding to these objections has been all the way through, we need to evaluate the Gospel in the same way as we evaluate other sources from antiquity. And when you do that it's really fascinating how well the Gospel can stand in comparison to other material from antiquity. The surprising thing is that we know so much about this historical individual. If you take as a comparison the mightiest man in the world at the time, the Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar. He was the emperor between AD 14 to AD 37. So for several decades, he was the emperor over the whole Roman Empire. You have to compare that to Jesus, who was a peasant preacher man during 3 years' time in a very limited place in the Roman Empire, in Galilee and Judea, for 3 years' time, without any financial resources, without any political or military power. Yet, if you compare them, you find a very interesting situation. The sources about the world's most powerful man, what about them? This is Sherwin White, a well-known historian of antiquity. He says this: the story of Tiberius' reign is known from 4 sources: the Annals of Tacitus and the biography of Suetonius, written some 80 or 90 years later, the brief contemporary record of Paterculus, and the 3rd centuries of Cassius Dio. These disagree amongst themselves in the wildest possible fashion, both in major matters of political action or motive and in specific details of minor events. But this does not prevent the belief that the material of Tacitus can be used to write the history of Tiberius. So there are 4 main sources, several of them on a distance from the actual emperor Tiberius. And there's a lot of contradictions in between them. In light of that, it's fascinating. We have 4 rather early biographies about Jesus, and there is not wild disagreements between them. So in terms of source material, we are in an interesting situation. How do we evaluate historical source material from antiquity? Well, it's generally evaluated according to a number of criteria. Here are some of the most important. How early is the source? How close to the event or the person that is described is the source? Who wrote it? How did the person get his information? Was he an eyewitness himself? Has he interviewed an eyewitness? Or is he further removed from the event? How many sources do we have? There is, of course, a radical difference between having 0 sources, then we know nothing, and having 1. But as long as we have only 1 source, there's always a question how to evaluate this source. So it makes a huge difference if we have 2 or more sources that confirm each other. And then, do we have general confirmations about the things that the source mentions? How well does it fit into the general picture we already think we have about the time, about the place, about the situation? Let me just briefly say something about how the Gospels are doing in relationship to those 4 areas. In terms of their date, we cannot date the Gospels with a specific date, like we can with some of Paul's letter, for example, where we have a precision of plus minus 1 or 2 years. But there is an agreement that the Gospels are 1st century sources. That makes them very early sources. They are written between 30 and 60 years after the death of Jesus. Jesus died in the early 30s. And the oldest Gospel is written 30 years after that, if we go with the majority dating of the Gospels. You can date them early, and there are some arguments for an early dating, but that does not make a huge difference. Because if you have sources 30 or 40 or 50 years after the event, it's still really early sources, because they are then written at the time when eyewitnesses are still alive. In Sweden, here is an historian who is a specialist on Italian fascism. And I heard an interview with her on Swedish radio. She's an historian from Umeå University. And she was talking about the rise of fascism in Italy. How is that possible? Well, the reason, she said, is that the eyewitnesses, the living memory of Mussolini and the fascism has now gone. And now you can start to reinterpret history, and fascism is coming back because there is no one who can protest because the eyewitness generation has gone. So it makes a big difference if the Gospels are written within the eyewitness generation, because then you cannot reinterpret history freely, because people would then protest. The authors were contemporaries with Jesus. There are arguments for Matthew and John being eyewitnesses, being the disciples of Jesus. So we have a kind of first-hand information. And that Mark and Luke, who were not eyewitnesses themselves, received their information from eyewitnesses. An early source, Papias, writes about Mark being the interpreter of Peter, traveling with Peter to Rome. And there's some confirmation of that in the New Testament. And writing the gospel after Peter's death. So what he is writing is actually a content coming from Peter, a very good eyewitness. You cannot come much closer to Jesus than Peter. And Luke himself, in the introduction to his gospel, says that he has his information from eyewitnesses and that he has carefully investigated everything. And we know from the book of Acts that Luke traveled with Paul and they visited Jerusalem and that they met with the apostles. And probably Luke met Jesus' mother, Mary, and that's why he can write about the birth of Jesus. In terms of number, we have what scholars call multiple attestation. We have not one gospel, we have not two gospels, we have 4 gospels. So we have several sources. Of course, they overlap because they are using the same material, but scholars also say there is behind those 4 gospels, there is a source which they call Q, so then you have even more sources if you take that into account. And those sources are in a basic agreement about the person of Jesus, about the teaching of Jesus, and about the fate of Jesus, his death and his resurrection. So we are in a strong position that we have early sources with material from eyewitnesses, and we have a number of sources. And the content in the Gospels are confirmed on many different questions in terms of how they describe politics in Israel, of Pontius Pilate being the Roman representative over Judea and Jerusalem, being based at Caesarea, coming up with his soldiers during Easter to keep control over Jerusalem. But Galilee being under a Jewish king, Herod, who was then subordinate to Rome. So Rome had chosen different ways of ruling in Israel, in Judea and Galilee, and the Gospels reflect that correctly. In terms of religion, what is said about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots, it's in agreement what we know from other sources, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus. What is said about finances or farming or geography, there are many places, cities and villages, mountains and lakes and rivers. There's topography. You go up or you go down. There is what's said about vegetation and trees. There is about architecture in terms of the temple. For example, in the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus was teaching in the hall of Solomon in the temple. And then it says it was winter. And of course, it's a meaningless comment from our perspective that it was winter. Okay, Jesus was teaching. Why are they saying it was winter? Well, that explains why he was teaching at that specific location at the temple, because the wind could not come in there. So that was a good place during wintertime when there was a more chilly wind to have your teaching there. You can think of social roles of women, of lepers, of poor people. You can think of clothing or food. On so many different issues, the gospel seems to reflect real life in Israel at the time. It fits with what we already know from other sources. A very exciting piece of confirmation has come alive through a professor of Jewish history called Tal Ilan, who collected all the Jewish names from some time before Jesus to some time after Jesus, all the Jewish names in documents and inscriptions, and started to catalog it in terms of the frequency and in terms of if people were named like that in Israel or outside Israel. So she is differentiating between Jews in Israel and Jewish groups in Egypt, for example. And she published this. So it gave new information about the frequency of names. And then a professor in New Testament, Richard Borkham, started to use that new information and compare it with the Gospels. And he wrote a book that I guess some of you have heard about, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospel as Eyewitness Testimony, which has caused a lot of discussion, and it's a very, very interesting book. Tal Ilan, in her statistics of the frequency of names, she shows that Simon is the most common name in Israel, followed by Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, and Jesus. So Jesus was the 6th most common name in Israel. And Simon was the most common name. Now, that information suddenly makes some aspects of the Gospels really relevant. So Simon is the most common name in Israel. What we can notice in the Gospel is that everyone named Simon has a nickname. Because you cannot say just Simon and assume that people know who you're referring to, because there are too many Simon. So Simon called Peter. Simon, that is Cananias. Simon the leper. Simon, that's a Simon from Cyrene, the father of Rufus, and Simon the Zealot, the one who has been involved in a political party. So you see, everyone called Simon has a nickname. I've been a teacher for many years, teaching in many different places. And if you have a group of students and there is more than one person with the same name, you have 2 or 3 with the same name, immediately in the group, you have to have a nickname so you can differentiate between the individuals. So it makes sense that all the Simons have nicknames in the Gospels because it was the most common name. In Matthew 10, Matthew gives us the list of the 12 disciples that Jesus uniquely selected. And if we put up the list and put the number of the behind the name of where the name is on the top list of the 99 most popular names in Israel, you will have this. Simon, most popular name in Israel, with a nickname, who's called Peter, and his brother Andrew. It's not even on the 99 list because that's a Greek name, very uncommon in Israel. James, quite common name, place number 11, an identification, son of Zebedee, and his brother, John, place number 5, an identification, his brother, also a son of Zebedee. Philip, very uncommon name, place number 61, no identification. Bartholomew, place number 50, uncommon name, no identification. Thomas, not even on the 99 list. And Matthew, common name in Israel, place number 9, and he's referred to his previous occupation, the tax collector. James, again, rather common name in Israel, place number 11, the son of Alphaeus. And Thaddeus, place number 39, no nickname. Simon, most common name in Israel, Simon the Zealot. And Judas, 4th most common name in Israel, that is Judas Iscariot. So we see it's a coherence here, that all the common names have an identification, the uncommon name has not. So this is some examples of how, in one sense, trivial information from the gospel fits into our general pattern of knowledge. And that means we have a confirmation of the general reliability as a source of historical information. So my only claim here is that the Gospels match very well other sources from antiquity that we take seriously. And therefore, we should take the Gospel seriously as historical material. And you can ask it as a question. What do other sources have that the Gospel lack? What do other sources that we do take seriously, what do they have that the Gospels don't have, that the Gospels lack? So the point here is that there are good historical reasons to start to study the Gospels in order to come in contact with the world's most influential figure, Jesus of Nazareth, and to come in a kind of direct contact with him as a person, with his teaching, with his life, with his unexpected death, and even more unexpected resurrection. So that is always my challenge when I talk with students that start to investigate into the world's most influential figure by studying the very interesting biographical material we have about him in the Gospels. And as Peter writes in his second letter, the first Christians, they claimed, we did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Okay, time for questions, and over to you, Alexander.